welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with two past guests. Joe's a little bit more frequent than Gavin is, but Gavin will get you on eventually a little bit more. I wanted to talk about the Tippit murder with you guys, but I wanted to discuss some things about the assassination, some things that we can all agree on, and maybe get a better picture for the audience out there about the whole Oswald leaving the TSBD, going to a boarding house, and whichever we might defer, whichever we might agree with. But guys, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Do you mind briefly introducing yourselves real quick? Gavin, we'll start with you, and then McBride will go with you.
Yeah, Gavan McMahon. I'm from Brisbane, Australia. Retired, former law enforcement officer, involved in border protection here in Australia. So a lot of my background in looking at the whole Tippit thing in particular that I've tried to focus on has been around looking at it through a bit of a law enforcement lens. So I've been using my experience, not trying to make things happen, but to try and analyse them, looking at it from a law enforcement perspective. And in particular, then the information that I started to gather, I was able to sort of put that in context and say, well, how credible is it? Does it make sense? And then tried to, draw some likely conclusions from that. So that's where I've come to this research.
McBride?
Yeah, I'm Joe McBride. Live in Berkeley, California, and I'm the author of two books on the assassination. The first was Into the Nightmare, My Search for the Killers of President John F. Kennedy and Officer J.D. Tippit, which came out in 2013. Thank you. Which I worked on for about 30 years. And then I did a kind of a spin-off book from that called Political Truth, the Media and the Assassination of President Kennedy, which came out in 2021. Which I'm very proud of. And it was going to be a chapter in Into the Nightmare, but I realized it was too big a subject for one chapter and needed a whole book because the mainstream media have been lying to us all these years. And there's kind of like two tracks of information. There's the New York Times, Washington Post, CBS, etc., who all blame the assassination on one guy, Oswald. And then there's the alternate media, which includes podcasts like this and internet forums and books and films. There's more freedom in books and films than there is in newspapers and magazines. And so I'm a journalist from way back from 1960 onward. And the same time I started selling articles to magazines, I worked as a volunteer in Kennedy's Wisconsin presidential primary campaign. I got to meet him three times, twice during that campaign and once when he was president. And so the assassination had a profound effect on my life. I actually wrote a short story about the assassination in October 1961, 2 years before it happened, because I was aware from meeting him up close that his security was almost non-existent, and I was concerned about that because I was into the Civil War at the time, and I was very into the Lincoln assassination, and I was worried about Kennedy's safety, and so I wrote a short story about it when I was a freshman in high school. And it's a piece of juvenilia, but it gets into certain things like the autopsy, and I realized it would be a conspiracy to kill a president. It's very hard for one person to do that on his or her own. And the Kennedy assassination is extremely complex. And the Tippit murder I started focusing on because I realized that it had hardly been investigated. The Warren Commission barely dealt with it. And Gary Muir wrote a pretty good unpublished book on it in 1971 that circulates, and that's about it until Dale Myers wrote a very deceitful book, which I call the Warren Report of the Tippit case, called With Malice. The title tells you everything you need to know about his conclusions. And but it's when something is kind of hidden and not investigated properly, my antennae go up as a journalist, and so that's one reason I dug into that aspect of the case. It's a very revealing and important part of the case.
Well, what you mentioned about your antenna going up at some certain areas that weren't pursued or investigated. When it comes to the Tippit murder, what are some areas for you guys? And Gavin, you can start first and we'll go into McBride, or McBride, feel free to interject if you have something. But some parts about the Tippit investigation that just didn't sit right with you. Some red flags, whether it comes to witness statements or just overall information that was put out as like, oh, this is how Oswald was linked to this. And then it's simple as that.
Yeah, I mean, some of the things when I look at it now and think the radio transmissions, I know listening to Joe, some of your podcasts, that there was a certain degree of excitement amongst the police when the Tippit shooting had occurred, as distinct from when the president was shot. But it still, to me, doesn't grab me as really the sort of excitement you got in a rare event as it was in the time of a policeman being shot. And when we'll get into a discussion a little bit later, I'm sure, about Officer Menzel, but when he's finally told there's a policeman shot in his district, he's just sort of like 10-4. No questions. No, what? So who? What? Nothing. Just business as usual. So there's certainly been some sort of interference that's gone on there, and I think we've got some good examples we can talk about there. Also, just the media response. I mean, there's newspapers that came out at the time, but you try and find some good photographs of the media hitting the area the day after, the day after, the day after, interviewing neighbours, who saw what, just about doesn't exist. So that's, again, an indication that's not by accident, because this was a very huge event. And you'd think the media would be all over it, and they've disappeared from the Oak Cliff area pretty well, because you got everybody there, including Mr. Ruby. So they're the two things that when I first started looking at it, I was very surprised of the lack of attention in both those areas.
I was struck by that too, that in the Warren report in the 27 volumes, there are two photographs of Tippit, and they're both old. One is from 1952 and one is from 1957. And in the 57 picture, you can't see his face very well because his police cap is kind of covering his eyes. And he didn't look that way when he was killed. He was much older looking and weathered and kind of gaunt. And I was struck by that, when there's a kind of a missing element. I was wondering that had to be done on purpose. They didn't want people to know what the man looked like, And so I started digging around, and it turns out that in the November 23rd Dallas Morning News, they had a recent photograph of Tippit in the paper, a good portrait. And the Warren report could have incorporated that if they'd wanted to. And in the sixth floor museum exhibit, I found a really good picture of Tippit, which showed his very distinctive hairline. He had a kind of a notch in his hairline, et cetera, and a very good likeness of him. But so that kind of thing was, an example of what wasn't being done. And Gavin's right. The media didn't really dig into it, but the significance of it, I gleaned partly from talking to Jim Lavelle, who was a detective who was in charge of the Tippit murder. He's a veteran homicide detective and a very garrulous and interesting fellow who made himself available to researchers and lived a very long life. But he was corrupt like a lot of the Dallas police, but he was, a smart fellow too. And Henry Wade, the DA, I interviewed him. And what they both told me was fascinating, that they said that Lavelle said that Captain Will Fritz, the head of homicide, who was in charge of the investigation, told Lavelle on the night of the 22nd, let's wrap up Oswald on the Tippit murder, because we really don't have much of a case at all on Oswald killing Kennedy. And that explains why there was some confusion. If you were watching television, as I was, Oswald seemed very surprised when reporters told him he was accused of murdering the president. And one reporter, you could tell the reporters thought he was lying. This is the midnight press conference, but he hadn't been told that. And Lavelle confirmed to me. They hadn't even told him, we're charging you with the murder of the president. And they only charged him with the murder of Tippit at first. They only arraigned him on the murder of Tippit. They never arraigned him at all on the murder of Kennedy. And but he was charged in the murder of Kennedy after the press conference. But in the public's eye, it was very psychologically important for them to brand this guy as a cop killer, because the logic, and it's backward logic, that the public bought pretty much at the time was, why else would he kill this cop 39 minutes after Kennedy was shot if he wasn't fleeing, from killing Kennedy? And he shot the cop out of desperation, or the heroic cop was trying to stop him, etc. And so psychologically, that was a propaganda thing that was used to sell the public on the idea that he must have killed Kennedy. And I said to Lavelle, what was the difference in these two cases that first night? And he said, well, with Tippit, we had witnesses. And in other words, he was implying they didn't have witnesses in the Kennedy killing, which is pretty much true. They had one very dubious witness, Howard Brennan, who really couldn't have seen what he claimed to have seen in
He
his
seemed to
eyesight.
remember more as time went on, which doesn't really work with witness accounts.
Well, and also he wouldn't identify Oswald in a lineup and that night, which kind of negates his credibility. And then he later claimed he was afraid for his life, which may have been true, but he couldn't see very well either. But in the Tippit case, yeah, there were witnesses, but the witnesses are all over the map. It's a fascinating Rashomon kind of story. There were about 10 or 20 people in the area. The picture behind me is one of the photographs taken a while after the shooting. But in the immediate vicinity, there were about 8 or 10 people who were nearby who saw parts of the event. And some people identified Oswald, but other people said there were 2 men who did it, and other people identified somebody who looked short and stocky with curly hair, and Oswald didn't look like that. And some of the people who identified Oswald, either identified him at a lineup where it was obvious who the guilty party was supposed to be, or they identified him months or years later, even, under duress. And so it took me a long time to try to sort out the witnesses. And Gavan has done some fascinating research into planted witnesses, and I'll let him explain. But I just want to give a little credit to Jerry Rose, who had a newsletter on the assassination in the 90s, proposed a theory that Jack Ruby helped stage the Tippit murder scene by having some of his cronies at the scene to, testify the way that the cover-up was supposed to be. And a lot of the people, or at least several of the people at the scene, had connections to Jack Ruby. And Gavan has found even more of that. So maybe I'll pass it over to Gavan on that one.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, the Davis girls, of course, living on the corner house. There was some sort of connection there to Ruby. We've got T.F. Bowley, who was the person that was driving, coming west on the street after the shooting, that actually ended up getting on the Tippit's police radio and calling in the shooting, connections to Ruby. And then my research identified through family connections with both the Markham family and the Scoggins family. So Helen Markham, of course, who was a witness standing sort of diagonally opposite the street and saw the shooting, testified at the Warren Commission. William Scoggins in a taxi cab parked facing north on the corner of 10th and Patton, on the south side of 10th and Patton, and he testified to the Warren Commission. And the family of both of those groups were able to confirm that they were both planted witnesses at the behest of Jack Ruby. So the Ruby connection, as Joe just mentioned, and Professor Rose had identified way back has been, I think, further consolidated now. As far as I'm concerned, it's beyond any consideration. It's pretty well a fact as far as I'm concerned now. Those families that have come forward, they've got no agenda. They're not spinning some story. There's no remuneration. They're not writing a book. All those things that you get hearing about people making stuff up. These are genuine folk who have kept the story for a long, long time. And the planted witnesses, to me, it just confirmed that that's what you're going to do in a planned interception. And Joe, in his book, and I'm sure he'll talk about shortly, the information he was able to glean from the Tippit family, it certainly adds up that there's a clear plan and a hunting of Oswald that's occurring. So we've got revelations now coming through Joe's research that's coming from family members of the Tippit family, and that's through Marie Tippit to Edgar, her father-in-law, J.D. Tippit's father, and then my connection now with the Markham family and the Scoggins family, who are civilians who have been placed in that location at a set place, at a set time, at a set event, and it's the interception that was planned. So we're talking about, as far as I'm concerned, no question about it, a conspiracy clearly staged by the Dallas police.
Yeah, the Tippit murder was an ambush. Tippit drove into this ambush, and one of the people I interviewed, as Gavin mentioned, was Edgar Lee Tippit, who was J.D. Tippit's father. And I was curious, being a biographer and journalist, wondering why nobody had interviewed Mr. Tippit. And he was 90 years old. He lived in East Texas. I drove way out in the boonies out there through these empty towns that had been abandoned, during the Depression. It was very spooky. And he was living in this little house with very nice old man, very sharp, very spry. He was a farmer all his life, and he was still working as a farmer at age 90. And Dale Myers tried to smear him after I reported what he said to me by claiming that Mr. Tippit was demented, which was not true at all.
I thought he called him an alcoholic.
No, he said he was suffering from dementia. But I've interviewed many people in their 90s and even hundreds. One of my jobs on a paper in Madison, Wisconsin, used to be when anybody turned 100 in Madison, I was the guy who did the story on the person, and we would kind of celebrate them. And I talked to a lot of these people, and I would always say, "What's your secret for living to be 100?" And they'd always say, "I smoke and drank all my life. I drank all my life." But a lot of really sharp people in their 90s, and then you meet people in their 50s and 60s who were kind of decrepit, But Mr. Tippit had lived a good, vigorous life, outdoorsman, et cetera. And anyway, I interviewed him, and he was kind of guileless. He just was very honest. It struck me, and I was very touched by the fact, for example, that he said it was such a shame that Oswald was killed, because he thought Oswald had killed his son, but he said we will never know exactly what happened, and it was, he said he felt really bad when Oswald was killed. I thought that was rather touching. But he told me that Marie Tippit, the officer's widow, told him a few days after the killing that a policeman had come to her to explain what happened. And Mr. Tippit didn't know the name of this policeman, but I figured it out. It's William Menzel, who had been a partner of Tippit, and he was the officer assigned to that district that day. J.D. Tippit was way out of his district by several miles. And one of the many odd things that happened that day, there were several policemen in the Oak Cliff area who weren't supposed to be there. And Tippit was one of them. And what was he doing there? And Mr. Tippit said that this policeman told Marie that he and JD were assigned to hunt down Lee Harvey Oswald, and they were told his name and that he was going to be going to Oak Cliff, which is where he lived. Oak Cliff is a suburb of Dallas, and there is a viaduct that connects it directly to downtown. You can get from Oak Cliff to downtown Dealey Plaza in about 5 minutes, depending on traffic. And so the police knew who Oswald was. I mean, that's part of the importance of that information. When they tell these two policemen to hunt down Oswald, and he's going to be in Oak Cliff, that means they knew who he was, and they knew that he was going to Oak Cliff. And the police had a kind of a red squad, a special service unit that kept tabs on so-called subversive people and all that. And they knew who Oswald was. And so Tippit and Menzel were sent to intercept Oswald, and Mr. Tippit didn't know, what their mission was. And so the question is, were they supposed to arrest him or shoot him? And I just sort of theorized that they probably would have, if had the opportunity, to shoot him, because if the police had killed the so-called assassin within 30 or 40 minutes of the assassination, they would have been hailed as geniuses. There are even people today who say, didn't the Dallas police do a great job? They caught the killer at 1:52 p.m. and blah, 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 But Oswald was not captured until 1:52 at the theater, the Texas Theater. And there was another person arrested in the balcony who was taken out the back. And John Armstrong, who's written an extraordinarily good book called Harvey and Lee about the two Oswalds, there are so many instances of sightings of two different people identified as Oswald, who looked not exactly alike, but similar. And they were seen at the same time in different places, or on this particular day, both were in the theater, and one of them was taken out the back and let go. And then the one that we know was hauled out the front and taken to the police station and, charged with the two murders. And so Mr. Tippit told me this story, and he didn't seem to realize what he was implying, that his son was part of the conspiracy. His son and Menzel had to be part of the plot if they were involved with trying to capture or kill the patsy in the case. I believe Oswald was the patsy. I don't think he shot anybody that day, as he declared on television. He said, "I haven't shot anybody, no, sir."
Do you trust the Murray Jackson, at least testimony or evidence when it comes to his statements about calling Tippit, being the dispatch officer that called Tippit to that area? Because it didn't make sense to me reading his testimony and him talking about that. Well, the reason Tippit might have got shot was because of his personality. And then he goes on to explain that Tippit always had his hand on his gun butt. And I was like, why would you send someone like that to go look for a possible suspect in the assassination of John F. Kennedy? It didn't make sense. And then some of those radio logs I had to look into after speaking with Gavin. I don't think they've released some of them because there's a bit of gap in it where there's like two calls or something like that where there's just, it doesn't link together. It seems like they skipped. And it hasn't been released, at least I submitted to the Warren Commission. But I'm wondering what your guys' thoughts are on the whole calling Tippit to Oak Cliff. If that's not his area and there's plenty of officers we know standing down, why would Murray Jackson send him over there?
Jackson was a friend of Tippit's, and he's the guy who gave a very odd instruction on the police radio to Tippit, which some people think was dubbed in later, where he singles out Tippit and he says, "You'll be at large for any emergency that may come in." And as Sylvia Marr wrote in her wonderful book, Accessories After the Fact, which I think is still the best book on the assassination, she said, it's really extraordinary to single out one officer in Oak Cliff when all hell is breaking loose downtown. The president's just been killed, and why would you tell this guy to be at large for any emergency that comes in, which she said was kind of axiomatic. Any policeman, that's his job, but it's some kind of a signal. But the whole thing with the transcripts of the police radio is very murky area that John Armstrong has studied this, and other people, Gavin as well. The Warren Commission, I mean, the Warren Commission asked the police department for a transcript, and they supplied a series of transcripts, which were, the first one was very sketchy, and the Warren Commission said, we want a fuller one, and they came up with another one. There are variations in each one. And Armstrong's theory is that they changed the timings around the time of after Kennedy was shot. They moved everything backward by about 8 minutes, I believe is what he says, because they wanted to make it possible for Oswald to have shot Tippit. Because two of the basic reasons Oswald couldn't have killed Tippit is, first of all, he was seen at his rooming house, which is 9/10 of a mile from where Tippit was killed. And he was seen about 1 o'clock by the housekeeper, Earlene Roberts, who's an important witness. And he went into his little room and just hurriedly did whatever he did in there and left after 2 or 3 minutes. And then he went outside, and she saw him standing at the corner waiting for something, waiting for a car or a bus or whatever. And she also, while he was in his room, she said a police car pulled up outside and honked the horn twice, and there were 2 policemen in the car. So Oswald is 9/10 of a mile away at about 1:03 p.m. and Tippit was killed about 1:06, 1:08, depends on, you know, there's a whole series of reasons why you might consider that. He couldn't have walked there that fast, and nobody saw him running, and the only way he could have gotten there that quickly is if he got a ride, and it's theoretically possible. But Oswald was also seen at the theater by Butch Burroughs, who worked at the theater, and the woman who sold tickets claimed he didn't buy a ticket, but she more or less indicated that he actually did. She broke into tears when she was asked about it. So he was in the theater at the time that Tippit was shot, 1:06, 1:08, 1:09, right around there. And T.F. Boley, who I interviewed, came upon the scene. He was driving by with his daughter, and he stopped, and he saw the policeman lying on the street. And he looked at his watch, and it was 1:10. He's the only person at the scene who looked at his watch. And the Warren Commission tried to claim that Tippit was shot at 1:15 or 1:16. And so they moved everything, several minutes later to give Oswald the chance to get there in time. The other thing that proves that Oswald didn't do it was the ballistics evidence does not match the revolver that Oswald allegedly had. And Armstrong proves in his book that there's no proof that Oswald owned a gun of any kind, whether the rifle or the revolver. And an honest FBI witness testified to the Warren Commission that he couldn't match the bullets in Tippit's body with the revolver. And there were 2 different kinds of ammunition and different shells and strange goings on with the ballistics. So the ballistics exonerates Oswald as well. But anyway, that's a short and simple exoneration of Oswald there. In my opinion, I guess Gavin disagrees with me on Oswald.
I mean, I can see both roads here. I guess the main question would be how deep, if you believe Tippit was part of the conspiracy, how deep do you believe that conspiracy was? Or how deep do you think his involvement was? Do you think he was there to pick up someone at the boarding house, like pick up Oswald? Obviously, someone was there if we stick along the lines of the car honking 2 times, if we believe that witness's statement that she saw a car.
Well, that is a big question that nobody really has a definitive answer to, and I don't say I do either. Tippit was eliminated, and you could figure out different reasons for it. One is, and Gavin alluded to this, when you listen to the police tape, I noticed this very early on in my research, that they're very blasé when they talk about Kennedy being shot. They're 10-4, one officer says, I heard the president's head is practically blown off, very kind of matter of fact But then when they say a policeman was shot, suddenly the voices kind of get raised and there's frantic transmissions, and all kinds of people say, "Yeah, where is it? Who got shot? What number is he?" And I asked Jim Lavelle, the homicide detective. I said, "Am I correct in assuming that Tippit's murder affected the police department a lot more than Kennedy's murder?" And he broke into this little wicked smile, and he said, "Well, it's like that old saying." He said, I said, "How did you regard the Kennedy murder?" And he said, "It was like that old saying. It wasn't no different than a South Dallas N-word shooting," is the way he put it. And he used the full word, which was really pretty shocking thing to hear from this guy. That's how they regarded Kennedy's death. There were a lot of racists in the police department. Some of them were Klansmen. One of the policemen I interviewed, Morris Brumley, who was Tippit's oldest friend in the police department. He knew him from boyhood. We were sitting in a diner with my tape recorder going on the table, and Brumley pulled out his wallet and proudly showed me his Ku Klux Klan membership card. I'm not kidding. He bragged about it, and the card was signed by the Grand Dragon and all this stuff. And I said, "You remember the Klan?" And he said, "Well, I infiltrated the Klan for the Dallas Police Department." And I told that to another researcher who lived in Dallas, and he laughed. He said, "Infiltrated the Klan." He said, "3/4 of the Dallas Klan were members of the police department." But Brumley started telling me horrific stories about how they would capture and castrate black men who were dating white women and stuff. And when you're a interviewer, your job is just to keep people talking, and not to be saying, "Oh, isn't that terrible?" I mean, but I finally had to say to him, "Well, you were infiltrating the Klan, and what about all this violence? Did you ever report this stuff?" And then he suddenly clammed up. I kind of stopped him from talking by indicating that, he didn't infiltrate them very well if he didn't report the crimes. But so they were very corrupt and racist group of people by and large. Although I must say, I looked for that any evidence of that with Tippit, and I didn't find any particular racism or extreme right wing viewpoints with Tippit. However, I did find that he worked in a barbecue joint called Austin's Barbecue in Oak Cliff, which is a very popular um, diner, which was a landmark there. It was right around the police station where Tippit worked. And all the cops would hang out there, and a lot of right wingers would hang out there, because Austin Cook, who I interviewed, the guy who owned it, was a John Birch Society member, and he knew General Edwin Walker, for example, the most prominent right winger in Dallas, and Austin had been a business partner of Ralph Paul, who was a shady underworld kind of character who bankrolled Jack Ruby. So it was another Jack Ruby connection. And Tippit worked in that diner on Fridays and Saturdays. He moonlighted as a security guard to watch the unruly teenagers who didn't like him very much because he was kind of, rough, obnoxious kind of guy. So he worked there for 2 years. And so Bill Alexander was another habitué of that diner, and he was a super right wing assistant DA to Henry Wade. And Wade had to fire him because he said publicly that Earl Warren should be hanged. And so Tippit, being there in uniform, would have been very familiar to a lot of right wing people. And I studied the whole right wing milieu in Texas, which I think was heavily involved in the assassination. And so Tippit was probably recruited from out of that milieu as a guy they could use for part of the plot. He was a rather undistinguished policeman, had never been promoted in 11 years, and The thing you mentioned about Murray Jackson saying Tippit had a personality problem, part of that was he was in World War II as a machine gunner, and he served in Europe at the very end of the war, but he was a paratrooper as well, and he had a very dangerous near-death experience when he was parachuting and training, and it caused him to have severe PTSD. And he had a psychological report in his police file that indicated that he had elements of psychosis. And one of the symptoms that he had for his PTSD is he couldn't look people in the eye, which is not an atypical problem if you have PTSD. And so, but that could be a fatal flaw for a policeman. You know, if you're looking at the ground when you approach a suspect, you know, that might have contributed to his death. And
Do you
people
believe that
mention,
PTSD could contribute to the fact that he stopped somebody through the front right vent window?
well, he apparently talked to whoever it was who shot him through the window, the little window of the car, you know. But he got out of the car and confronted whoever it was. But people said, at least Helen Markham said they seemed to know each other, and it was kind of a casual looking encounter, and people were surprised when it climaxed in a shooting. But Tippit was apparently caught off guard. He was lured into this trap. One of the stories that went around was one of the Davis sisters who lived at the corner house, two young women, said if you could see the house in the background where the policeman is standing, the house behind him. She said that Tippit lived in that house. We knew Tippit because he lived in that house and he was there all the time. And other people said, yeah, he was in the neighborhood all the time. And there was a Ruby stripper who was reportedly living in that house. And Tippit lived in a house miles away. And actually, he and his wife owned two homes, which is very unusual for a policeman making, I think it was $463 a month. He was financially overextended, which would be a good motive for him to get involved in a plot. And but he was known in the neighborhood, and that could be one reason he was lured into that particular location.
Yeah, interesting. You talked there about Murray Jackson and the radios. I think Larry Harris did a lot of work early on, and I know he's written some material, and I have seen some written material Larry Harris had put down where he talked about Murray Jackson actually staying at the Tippit house the night that he died, slept on the couch, and that he also certainly believed that Murray Jackson was involved, whether ordered to do changes to the radio logs, to the tapes, to overdub. Now, we'll wait and see. I think there's some sort of manuscript or something that people have got that Larry Harris has pulled together, and I'm interested to see whether that made its way into the final cut. But when you look at Murray Jackson and the radio logs being interfered with, he kind of gives the game away himself in that radio interview he did with Eddie Barker in '67, where he starts to talk about Tippit. He tried to call Tippit, I think it was 103, couldn't get an answer. And then he talks about this disturbance. And a call sheet came through to me, which is the lady, I think, in the police radio room there, who takes the phone call from the public, writes it down, hands it through on a tray, and it goes through to the dispatchers. And Murray Jackson's talking about this disturbance that occurred, and he tried to call Officer Tippit in relation to the disturbance. That radio log doesn't get a mention anywhere. Now, there's Murray Jackson telling you he's reliving what he did, and it doesn't make it. Another couple of examples, and interestingly, when Joe was talking before about his book as compared to Dale Myers' book, the two Tippit calls made at 108. They make it into Joseph McBride's Into the Nightmare as Tippit's calls. They don't make it into Dale Myers. It's like as if it didn't happen. The three lots of radio logs, by the second radio log, the two Tippit calls at 108 are there. Now, they're never answered. Well, as far as the record has shown, there's no answer. I think there's a strong possibility there was some communication that's been taken out. But the logs showed back then, that was Jim Bowles was involved pulling all that together. And Jim Bowles is quite clear, and I'm not a fan of Vincent Bugliosi, but in his book, he states categorically that he heard over the telephone as Bowles played him the tape. And there's Bugliosi saying, I can hear 78, which is Tippit's call sign. So Jim Bowles is sort of pretty convincing, and he's got some corroboration there from, of all people, Vincent Bugliosi, that call was Tippit. By the time the third lot of transcripts, which involved heavily the FBI, see Exhibit 1974, those two calls at 108 are no longer 78, which is Tippit's. They're 488 and 58, and they're garbled. And when you get to the definition of who the numbers are allocated to as far as police officers, unknown. So the whole thing's just been moved. I think early on they decided to leave it in, and then they've changed their mind come August 64, and it's disappeared. And I think when I've looked at my research and the information I was getting from the Markham family and from the Scoggins people, the phone calls around that time line up precisely where Joe's just talking about the timing of the shooting. And it's somewhere around that time. And I think it's quite looking through a law enforcement lens here, what would you expect the policeman to do? He's been called, he's been notified of a disturbance, which Murray Jackson made reference to. Well, the Markham family have certainly made reference to a disturbance because they said they were involved in planning it. And that's James Markham in the gang, Jack Ruby, Floyd Hamilton, their uncle, and that was a staged event down at 10th and Marsalis, which is where we're then saying eventually Mr. Oswald, because I believe it is Oswald, is walking west. He's certainly confirmed by one of the Smith boys who's working at a property there down at Crawford, I think it is, Denver. And across the road, we've got Jimmy Burton, another Smith boy. Just by coincidence, not, those three lads are also members of the gang. So the gangs had some sort of involvement in preparatory setting up this kind of scene. And there's Murray Jackson, I think, letting slip a little bit, talking about this disturbance. Because it's very hard when you're lying a lie, sometimes a little bit of truth leaks through because you've lived it. So it's hard to erase it totally. And you're trying to tap dance and think on your feet. And he would have been under a bit of pressure. He's being interviewed, he's being filmed, Murray, Eddie Barker, that sort of thing. I think he's just slipped a little bit. But certainly that scenario, that 108 calls to me would be quite likely that Tippit's calling up to say, I've identified the suspect that you've reported relevant to this disturbance moving west on 10th. And then maybe a short period afterwards, he's then called up to say, I'm just going to pull over and interview this person and send me some backup. Boom, what's sitting in between those two houses that Joe just mentioned? Police car, second police car. And we've got multiple people talking about that now. We're not talking about somebody, a strange reference to a second police car with two police officers in it. You've originally got the Davis girl, Virginia, in her Warren Commission testimony, talking about by the time she went out onto the street, police are already there. Well, that's not what the official record says at all. There's Officer Tippit's been shot and killed on the ground. Police aren't there for several minutes. And she's talking about when Oswald, the person's gone around the corner, she comes out onto the street and the police are already there. And I think that's the connection to that second police car. That second police car eventually just reverses out the driveway. We've got the Markham family confirming that very information, second police car. And the information I've put in my article is quite specific about one of those police officers. The older of the two came out to Tippit's body, looked, and then retreated and went back up to the police car. The Markham family certainly said that there was two people present. There was Oswald, and they're talking that it's Oswald because they're saying they had some connection to Oswald. Helen Markham knew Lee Oswald. He'd been to her house on 9th Street. The gang were involved, James Markham and William Markham, in taking Lee Oswald on a housebreak and into the Oak Cliff area. And that was to set him up for an arrest charge. And we then got the planted witnesses scenario with Helen Markham. So all of that is a very, well planned, well coordinated, orchestrated. I think they've got control of Oswald. He's certainly been on the pay books with the FBI. There's certainly intelligence fingerprints all over him. Their ability to control him, I think, would have been fairly straightforward. So he's either following orders he's been told to do. There's certainly FBI reports of Dallas police officers through intelligence reports referring to a person by the name of Max Long, who's connected to Ruby, connected to New Orleans, who's an ex-boxer, World War II vet, and he lived just near the Abundant Life Church, which is only about another 50, 60 metres further on up the road if Oswald had kept walking in a westerly direction. And that report from that intelligence informant through the Dallas police is saying that that's where the destination was that Oswald was heading. So if all of this it's got a truth to it, and I think there's a hell of a lot there. It's a planned interception at a location. They've got operational security of the area. As Joe mentioned, they're visiting that area because there was a stripper or somebody working there. They were frequenting. One of Tippit's colleagues, Tilson, talked about supposedly Tippit visiting a girl there. I mentioned in my article that the name I was told was Sunshine. I do have her name, but I haven't put that out there. So I think when I look at it through my lens, law enforcement, the big picture to me is that it's a conspiracy to take out the president. And that was that well done that we're still trying to figure out exactly how that went down in Dealey Plaza. We know there's multiple shooters. We know there's front and shots from the rear. And as much suspicion as we've got, we haven't identified exactly who. We don't need to. The evidence there says it's a conspiracy. When I put on my hat and think, well, you're planning an operation of this nature, as Joe alluded to before, what are you going to do with the case? Are you going to have a shooter, multiple shooters, just leave the country, disappear? Or are we going to arrest them and have a trial? Or are we going to eliminate the patsy? And I think from the get-go, to me, it's quite clear looking at all of this information now, and particularly when you start to hear what Edgar Tippit has told Joe, that Edgar got from Marie Tippit, that they were hunting Oswald. And that then brings in, I think, the mystery act that Officer Menzel has on the day. I'm sure we'll touch on that shortly. But it's certainly, all of that package to me quite simply says that there is going to be a patsy, and the patsy's going to be killed. And the whole thing would have been wrapped up in an hour. And the Dallas police, as Joe, you indicated, would have been seen as heroes. We certainly wouldn't have heard of the name Ruby very much. We certainly wouldn't have heard the word patsy come out of Oswald's mouth. There's a whole lot of stuff that unraveled the longer he stayed alive.
Well, staying away from the debatable point if Oswald was the killer of Tippit or not, let's stick along the lines of him being a patsy. Where would they get their information to be aware of Oswald and obviously his background? Obviously, the FBI, when he returned from Russia, was keeping a file on him. In the CIA, too. I mean, somebody goes to defect to another country, that's a national security threat. I would hope that our agencies are at least doing that much work to keep a threat like that under control. But Jesse Curry made a statement that the FBI usually warns them about certain people with this type of background so they would be able to be informed and have notes or tips or just be able to monitor him. But do you believe the Dallas police were already aware that Oswald had this type of communist background? And if we do believe the subject of him being a patsy, I mean, you're looking for someone who just allegedly killed the president. You know of a guy with a communist background that fits a description that nobody would really question if he was arrested. Wouldn't that fit Oswald? So wouldn't you just send somebody to go pick that guy up and monitor him?
Well, Oswald was an FBI informant, in my opinion.
I believe when John Fain interviewed him, that's when it happened.
Yeah, back in New Orleans, he was arrested for passing out literature, and he asked to see a specific FBI agent, which is very indicative. But Henry Wade, the DA, told me that it was really interesting when I interviewed Wade, who was a sharp character, very corrupt guy, but I usually start with some softball questions and kind of build up to it. And Wade had, started saying, well, don't you have any more interesting questions to give me? And so then I started hitting him with some really tough ones, and he was very happy to talk. And he said, well, I found out that first of all, he confirmed that the police knew who Oswald was. He told me that, and they were tracking him down. He said he heard this from the cops. And then he said, Oswald met with the FBI the day before the assassination. And I said, the day before? And he said, well, a day or two before. And in his oral history with the Sixth Floor Museum, which you can see online, Wade says that he got that information from Jack Revel, who was an important cop who was probably involved in the conspiracy, who was part of that special service bureau that I told you about, keeping tabs on suspicious characters. And so they knew who he was. And he got the information, according to Wade, from James Hosty, the FBI agent who was assigned to Lee and Marina Oswald. And then Oswald went to the FBI office around November 12th and delivered a note. This came out in the 70s when Hosty gave testimony to a congressional committee. Oswald gave a note that he described, Hosty described as a threatening note. Stop pestering my wife, or I will do something violent. And when Oswald was killed, Gordon Shanklin, the head of the FBI in Dallas, told Hosty to rip up the note, and he flushed it down the toilet. And this was around November 12th. And then the Dallas Morning News, I discovered, the day Oswald was shot, November 24th, that Sunday's paper, which came out on the streets, like 5:30 in the morning before Oswald was shot, it said that Oswald had met with the FBI on November 16th. So there you have 3 meetings at least that month between Oswald and the local FBI. I think he was an informant keeping tabs on the plot to kill Kennedy, and he was in the Texas School Book Depository, and he was monitoring what was going on. And he was also keeping tabs on anti-Castro Cubans, had a safe house in Oak Cliff, and there was gun running involved. With Ruby was involved in some of that, and there are allegations Oswald knew Ruby. And so Oswald was well known to the Dallas police. And I should mention that John Armstrong has a slightly different view of those 108 phone messages. He thinks, well, anyway, Domingo Benavides was the closest eyewitness. He was in a truck right across the street from the Tippit car, and he pulled over his truck when he saw the incident occurring and ducked for cover. And Benavides, when he saw the policeman shot, he said he waited in his truck for several minutes, is what he said. But people's estimation of time can be off, but it could have been maybe a minute or two. But he went over and tried to use the police radio to call in that a policeman was shot. And Armstrong believes the 108 calls were not from Tippit, but from Benavides, and he didn't know how to use the radio. So he wasn't able to say anything. He just tried to click the thing. And Boley told me that when he came upon the scene at 110, he said Benavides was trying to use the police radio, and Boley worked for a radio company. He worked for the local telephone company, and he knew everything about radios and electronics. And so he said, let me call it in. And he called in the official report, picked up the speaker. So Armstrong thinks the shooting took place at 106, and that's there are a couple people. Roger Craig, who was a very good witness, who was a deputy sheriff, was in the school book depository, and he said he heard on the police radio at 106 that an officer had been shot. And other people, there are a couple of other witnesses who said 106. So Larry Ray Harris, who was a terrific researcher, unfortunately died in a car crash when he was only 44, but wonderful guy. Gave me a lot of help. He was so dedicated, he actually took a job as a mailman on the route in Oak Cliff to research the case, and he got a job at the Texas School Book Depository when it was closed to the public. But anyway, I asked him when the shooting took place, and I think he said 108. And another guy who's a super expert on the case, Greg Lowry, who is living in Dallas area, I think he told me 109. So 108, 109. Part of it is because the police dispatcher, when he heard the policeman was shot, immediately tried to signal Tippit, which is kind of suspicious in itself, you know. And a couple things that happened in between that we didn't mention. When Tippit was racing around Oak Cliff at about 1 o'clock, he pulled into a record store called Top 10 Records on Jefferson, which is the main big street, you know, block down from the shooting site. And he came in a big hurry and commandeered a telephone, which you can still see on the counter. And he said he had to make a call, and he dialed the phone, and he listened and didn't say anything, and he put it down, and then he went off and took off at a high rate of speed and went around the corner, and then he stopped a guy named James Andrews who was driving his car on 10th Street, and Tippit pulled him over and didn't say anything, and he looked in the back seat of the car like he's looking for Oswald, you know. And Andrews saw the name tag Tippit, and then Tippit continued down 10th Street. Oddly, when he accosted whoever shot him, he was driving slowly and calmly, and he had been frantic a few minutes before. And so what happened in between, he may have been tipped off about something, that he was supposed to go to this particular place. And you notice the police car in the background, it parks right blocking the driveway there, which is interesting. And that's where the other police car was, in the driveway. And there's an alley there, and the police car backed up out of the alley, and there's a kind of an alley going the opposite direction, and disappeared. Armstrong believes that Captain Westbrook, who was the head of personnel, and Croy, who was a reserve officer, were in the police car. You know, one of the reasons that, you know, I did my book on Tippit, because I knew that I couldn't get the whole story. I did my best for a long time. I was hoping that other people would pick up the case, and so I'm really glad that John Armstrong has dug into it, and Gavan has dug into it, and Greg Lowry is still digging into it, and that's what you hope will happen. And you know, I think it's quite likely that Croy was the policeman who the Davis woman saw at the scene, you know, when she came outside. And that contradicts the Warren report, because the Warren report says it took several minutes for policemen to come to the scene. But there was this police car there. Westbrook would have been in plainclothes. And he's considered a major conspirator by Armstrong. And but, you know, I'd like to, I think it's a really important question. Was it Oswald who shot Tippit? And I don't see any evidence that it was, but Gavan.
I know that we guys disagree on that point, so there's not even really a point in even talking about it. Let's just try and stick to some of the basics.
Well, it just shows you, it just shows you that, you know, intrepid researchers can disagree on key points, because this is still kind of mysterious.
Well, I think the key, I was just going to say, the key that I'm seeing with all that, though, is that we've got a conspiracy, we've got a hunting Oswald scenario, we've got information from police officers' family explaining roles of Menzel and Tippit that day. We've got the Markham family planted witness. We've got Scoggins confirming planted witness, teed up specifically through a mob-connected associate of Ruby at the request of Ruby. So there's no confusion with these families as what they're telling. That second police car, the Markham family are very clear. There's two uniformed police officers. That's what Helen Markham is saying. One was slightly older. The younger one stayed back at the car. had some sort of a notebook and was either then working the radio in the car, because we don't hear any of that transcript. The second policeman, the older policeman, came out to the car. This is according to Helen Markham. Then went back to the car. The car then left the area, as Joe just explained, reversed out that driveway into that alley, then reappeared back at the scene. So Helen Markham has said that, and I'll put that in that article I wrote for Garrison last November, that those two police officers reappeared when the rest of the police kind of appeared at the scene. So they're in the first group reappearing, but they're both in uniform. She's also then said that, yes, a wallet did appear at the scene. She wasn't able to say whether it was Oswald, Haddell, any of that sort of stuff, but a wallet surfaced at the scene. In her view, it was supposedly found on the ground by the younger of the two police officers and reintroduced. And it's quite interesting when you look at some of this information that over the many, many years, you got a Lancer conference there way back in the 90s. And you got two police officers did arrive at the scene fairly early on in the piece, Officers Poe and Jez. Jez is younger than Poe, and I think Gerald Hill in his testimony refers to young Jez. And Jez told a researcher quite clearly that wallet, you can bank on it, he said, had Oswald and Haddell identification in it. So he's a policeman who was at the scene telling a researcher in the 90s at a Lancer conference that it was Oswald Haddell ID in that wallet. So
which is interesting because they didn't officially they didn't know who Oswald was until they got him downtown, because in the police car outside the theater, they pulled the wallet out of his pants. It was a different wallet, and they claimed it had two forms of identification, one for Lee Harvey Oswald and one for A.J. Haddell. Although Armstrong believes that the Haddell card was planted later. But this is where, this is a cold case going back more than 60 years. So Gavin and I and other people are digging into leads and witnesses that are, a lot of the witnesses are gone. There are a few people still around, but we're lucky to have found who we did. An interesting thing, Menzel, one thing about him, now he would have been a conspirator too with Tippit, and according to Marie Tippit through Edgar, Menzel said, I got into a auto accident on the way, and I didn't make it to the scene, but JD made it, and he got killed, and I didn't. And he felt very guilty about that, he told Marie. And I found in the police records there was an auto accident just a couple blocks from the Tippit shooting a few minutes later. And the policeman one of the policemen who was sent to the scene was Menzel. And he cleared the incident in 4 minutes, which is, you can't really investigate even a fender bender in 4 minutes. But there's a oral history of Menzel's widow, Ardice Menzel, the sixth floor museum, in which she talks about some of the same things. She basically confirms what Edgar Lee Tippit was saying, that her husband was hunting for Oswald and he got into an accident. And unfortunately, the interviewer from the sixth floor museum keeps changing the subject every time she starts going on about these things. But, you piece these things together, and Menzel was part of the plot. And apparently she said he felt guilty his whole life after this incident. So
she was quite emotional. That was 40 years after the event, she was still quite emotional, talking about how it impacted her husband, who had died by the time she did the interview. But certainly the Menzel things, it hasn't been explained, because when we're talking about radio logs being interfered with, I am very careful now not to sort of, lock something down because of the logs. I look at that car accident that he was called to, and Officer Nolan was called to, the accident prevention officer, wherever they are, and that could all be manufactured. It wouldn't take very much adjustment to the logs. But I think the important thing was that Ardice was reconfirming basically what Joe had identified through Edgar Tippit, that she was quite clearly saying that her husband should have got there first had he been there, but Tippit was called there. She says Tippit was called to get Oswald. So it's like, how much more do we need to join the dots here? It's very clear the families from the police on the Tippit side and also the mental side have been told certain pieces of information. I don't think they were told the full story, but enough to comfort them, to give them some sort of a closure to a degree about what happened. Joe's talking to Edgar and he's not thinking he's giving the game away at all. In actual fact, he is giving the game away. He didn't think, obviously, from his own perspective, what he was saying was secret. He thought it was that's what I've been told, and that's how it went down. But I think with the mental thing, it's interesting when you look at his explanation come the Warren Commission, not that he testified, but he's at Luby's restaurant in Jefferson from 12:32 to 1 o'clock or thereabouts, and then only hears about the shooting of the president after he's finished his lunch, and then calls
It's
up.
pretty
and
preposterous, right? Yeah,
it is. And then all of a sudden, come the HSCA, the investigators wanted to talk to him. They talked to him twice, and all of a sudden, here's a situation with a policeman who can't remember where he was when he heard President Kennedy was shot, because at about 12:40, he said 12:40, maybe 12:42, 45. He's told by one of the staff members in the food hall at Luby's, the president's been shot. He puts down his tray of food, leaves, doesn't he? So he's now in his car, and he said that to the HSCA people. He's in his car from about, let's say, 12:40, 12:45, until they reckon about 1:07 or something like that, when there's a call in relation to this auto. So the transcripts, I think, have made him disappear and make him be occupied. But in actual fact, he's probably doing some stuff very similar to Tippit at the time. Was he actually seen by mistake and people thought it was Tippit? Don't really know. But the sort of way that the mental data has just kind of disappeared from the radio logs, and there's a legitimate accident, and he's waiting for Officer Nolan. And then, as I said, when he finally gets told, 5 minutes roughly after the shooting of Tippit, that an officer died in his district, 10-4.
How much do you believe that the radio logs would reveal about this whole area of the assassination? Do you think it would solve anything? Obviously, probably more when it comes to the Tippit murder, but do you think it would be some important pieces to the case? Because it seems like we would have a figure, or at least a number, or a better answer on the discrepancy of some of the times.
Well, as I was mentioning, Armstrong put together a very good, logical explanation for how they altered the tapes to change the timings. And there are clues inside the tapes that you can tell that the tapes were altered by about 8 minutes or 10 minutes. And a lot could have been erased. And Jim Bowles wrote a book, and he mentioned, he was one of the officers, and he said that the tapes were collected, I believe, that day, and they were taken to a studio in Oklahoma. And they were probably tampered with there, and things were dubbed onto the tapes, like the strange order to, be at large for any emergency that may come in might have been dubbed onto the tapes, and inconvenient things might have been eliminated. And, the fact that Tippit, for example, went to a public telephone in a record store to make a phone call suggests that he wasn't going to use the police radio to contact whoever he was supposed to contact. A lot of this was off the record, and Tippit was known to use telephone booths, when he's driving around, and he was, involved in a lot of suspicious activities. A lot is not known about Tippit. Alan Dulles, when Chief Curry was testifying, Alan Dulles said, is there any information about Tippit allegedly being involved in narcotics? It just came out of the blue. Alan Dulles, former head of the CIA, asked this question. And Curry said, well, I don't know anything about that or whatever, but, what's that about? Tippit was involved, worked in another theater where the guy who ran it was involved in a lot of prostitution activities in town. And so he was involved in a shady milieu. And Also, he had a mistress, Johnny Maxie Witherspoon, who I interviewed at length, and she gave me a very candid interview. There is a whole theory that, um, I mean, she got pregnant, supposedly by Tippit, and right around that time, she found out she was pregnant, and she had a daughter who was born in the following year. And some people have tried to claim that her jealous husband, her estranged husband, shot Tippit. And Greg Lowry said he looked into this a lot, and a couple of people went to try to interview this husband, and he got very angry. And I've looked into that matter. I don't think the husband was around that day. But the one thing Mrs. Witherspoon was evasive about, it's interesting what people don't tell you. She was very candid about the sexual relationship she had with Tippit. And Marie Tippit, for example, came into the Austin's barbecue after the killing of her husband and wanted to see the waitress. I want to see the waitress, because she wanted to find out who left some flowers on my husband's grave. And there was an inscription with the flowers. And I mentioned this to Mrs. Witherspoon. She said, "Yeah, I left those flowers," and the inscription was something like "to the best man I ever knew," or something to that effect. And sort of a comical touch is that Mrs. Tippit at one point went to find Helen Markham, who was the waitress, and she was under the confusion that maybe Helen Markham was having an affair with her husband. But it wasn't her, it was Johnny Maxie Witherspoon. But the one thing she wouldn't really tell me, I said, "Where were you at the moment Tippit was shot?" And she just wouldn't really say. She said, "I was around there, in that neighborhood somewhere." And I said, "Well, exactly where?" And she wouldn't give me the address. And I said, "How far away?" And she was kind of cagey about it. And is it possible that Tippit was sent there to rendezvous with Mrs. Witherspoon? And she claimed that the daughter was not Tippit's daughter because she said Tippit had a vasectomy, which was a complete surprise for me to hear this. And I did some research on this, and vasectomies have become a very common thing in recent years, but they were happening back then. But it would have been unusual for a man to have a vasectomy in the 60s. But um, her husband, Steve Thompson was his name. They reconciled after the Tippit killing, and he was convinced that the daughter was Tippit's daughter. And Greg Lowry said, "Look at the mileage they got out of this jealous husband story." That was kind of he thinks it was a cover story for all kinds of really much more sinister things that were going on. Uh, yeah, but I don't think Thompson was on the way to work at a liquor store when the shooting took place, as far as I could tell. But trying to identify the shooter is a complicated matter. There was a fellow named Darrell Wayne Garner, who I think is a possible suspect, who was a petty criminal who worked for Jack Ruby, and he died at age 30, not long after this, of a heroin overdose, supposedly, although it's kind of suspicious. But um, he was Warren Reynolds was a guy who worked in a car lot uh, up on Jefferson, about a block away, and he saw the guy escaping from the Tippit murder scene, and he wouldn't identify him as Oswald. And so then the FBI interviewed Reynolds in January of '64, and again he wouldn't identify him as Oswald. And I think it was the next night somebody came into his car lot and shot him in the head. And then he said, "Oh yeah, it was Oswald. He saw the light when he got shot in the head, miraculously survived, Mr. Reynolds." But the guy who was the suspect in that shooting was Darrell Wayne Garner, but he provided an alibi witness who was a Ruby stripper, and she was arrested on a kind of disturbance complaint, and she was found hanged in her cell with her own pants. I mean, so this guy Garner could have been the shooter of Tippit. That's another Ruby connection. If Ruby wanted to provide a hitman, Garner would have been a possible handy guy to have around.
We somehow keep slipping back into the whole who killed Tippit thing. So let's just talk about one thing, which is not did Oswald do it, but the witnesses that stated they either saw one person or they saw two people. How do you have that big of a conflict of people that saw that there was two people there, considering that a lot? I mean, if Oswald's just one person, and if he's described as a lone nut, that wouldn't fit the two people thing. But obviously, there's people that stated they're all looking at the same situation. I'm just wondering how everyone can have such a different account of what the hell's going on, especially in that small vicinity.
It's a small, kind of quiet little street, but there were two police cars there, and there were two cops in that car, and then there was a guy on the street, and then there was Tippit, and Helen Markham, catty corner to the shooting. But Aquila Clemens, a very important witness, a black woman who was working as a domestic half a block down, heard the shots. She didn't see the shooting, but she heard the shots and came out on the porch, and she saw two men going off in different directions. One waved to the other and kind of signaled the other. And she said one was thin and the other guy was short and stocky. And but the thin guy was not Oswald. She wouldn't identify Oswald. She was a very brave woman. You can imagine a black woman in Dallas going against the police in those days, was risking her life to tell the truth. And she gave an interview to Mark Lane for the film Rush to Judgment, which has just been restored, by the way. And a great interview, but she was never seen again after that interview in '64, unfortunately. And a lot of people, me included, tried to find her, but there's no record of her. I think I found a trace that she may have moved to Philadelphia, but then she kind of disappears. But she gave several interviews, and she said it wasn't Oswald. It was two guys involved, and there are other people who said there were two men involved, and but it is Rashomon. It's very confusing because some of the witnesses were lying, and as Gavan found out, Helen Markham and Scoggins, the cab driver, were both paid, according to your research, right, to be witnesses, and also intimidated to some extent to keep them on the straight and narrow, right?
So you've got Helen certainly being paid. You've got the two Markham brothers, James and William, paid $1,000 each to take Oswald on a break and enter to set him up for an arrest. And that was going to form part of the Tippit interaction with Oswald. It was to be part of this arrest. And then it was to do with this disturbance up at Marsalis. And the whole plan unraveled because the reverse of what was supposed to happen happened, and you had Tippit dead on the ground. But Scoggins, no, there was no mention of a payment other than he was rewarded with a cushy job in the aviation industry for quite a period of time. It was actually aviation he was working in prior to cabbing, and then he was cabbing, and then he went to this cushy job. Now, his son, Calvin, told Ken, his son, who was the person that told us the whole story. So Ken's father, Calvin, was told that job was well above his pay grade. So he was given a cushy job. And it's interesting that the information that he imparted to his son was at the end of another 15 years, which is when he would have retired from that job. So his concern was the threat, not from the Dallas police, but from the mob. And Ken Scoggins is quite clear that William Scoggins was connected. He wouldn't be the first time he's been selected to do a job like that if it's really involved setting something up for the police. This is somebody who's trusted, and trusted means also to keep your mouth shut. Well, he did exactly that. And even when he told his son Calvin some 15 years later about what happened, he didn't impart a lot. And there's a hell of a lot more I'm sure William Scoggins knew. Now, if, as the Markham people are saying, is that second man that came out from that second police car and stood behind Oswald, who they've referred to as being an Italian extraction. I've referred to him being the Italian man. He's come out of a crime group in Dallas called Little Italy West Dallas. I have no idea who that is, but that's what they're saying. So I'm providing that information that's what they're saying. That person has certainly got connections, therefore, I think, to Scoggins' connection to the mafia mob associate. So I can full and well understand why at a later point when Scoggins is telling his son years later about what happened, he's just said there's two people and they separated. But he said one was Oswald. So the Markham people are saying it's Oswald, and Scoggins is telling his son, who told Ken, the guy that I've done the interview, people can see the interview on YouTube, it goes for about 20 minutes, quite clearly that it is Oswald. But he's not talking about the other man, and if it's Italian man, it's connected to the mob, there's no way he was going to say it.
And we should say Ruby was obviously mob connected, and the Warren Commission tried to kind of hide that fact. But the night before the assassination, Ruby went to the Campisi's pizza restaurant, where actually when I interviewed Larry Ray Harris, he said, "Why don't we meet at Campisi's? We have a pizza and have a good time." But Campisi was the local mob chief who worked under Carlos Marcello, who was the New Orleans capo de tutti capi, whatever the word is. He was the guy who ran the Dallas mob from New Orleans, but Campisi was tight with Ruby. So Ruby was tight with the mob, and the mob would do jobs for the CIA and the police. It didn't mean that it was just a complete. The mob could not have, for example, run the autopsy on Kennedy or stolen his body from Parkland Hospital, and all these different. They couldn't have appointed the Warren Commission, but they had a low-level involvement. One thing I was curious, Gavin, maybe you could explain a little more about that disturbance that was a couple blocks away. I've never been able to find out very much about that, but you had some information on that, huh?
Yeah, look, I come across that through Bill Pulte and Michael Brownlow. And Bill Pulte, as you know, you met him a few times there in Dallas with Greg Lowry. And they'd worked with Harry Livingston a fair bit and gathered some information. And Harry put it in his book. Which one was it?
The Radical.
The Radical Right.
Radical Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And it talks about it in there, and he corrects it because the early information was talking about 12th and Mars sailors. It was 10th and Mars sailors. In the article, I've just covered off that the Markham family is saying they were involved in planning that. So all of the staged events were organised by James Markham, Floyd Hamilton, who's uncle, and Jack Ruby.
What was the purpose? What was the purpose of that fracas? Somebody got stabbed?
Yeah, there's variations on the story, and Pulte and Brownlow have got sort of a variation as well. There's a disturbance, a fight, and the Brownlow information suggesting there was 3 males and a female, and one of the males was stabbed and bundled into this car and then driven off. And of course, you go, that's what everybody does when you stab someone. You put them in your own car and drive off with them.
Very, very strange. Yeah.
It's my understanding, and the Markham people were saying, yes, that is what their understanding with what this was all aimed in achieving, was that radio calls would appear, as in a Murray Jackson, saying there's been a report of a disturbance. Now, disturbance is not a shooting or a stabbing. It may be a fight or some noise or vandalism or something. So some disturbance is called in by the public, or the radio call is just put through, there's a disturbance. That gives justification to Officer Tippit to now suddenly be coming from the opposite direction, heading east on 10th, heading in the direction of a reported disturbance, and a man heading west on foot, which is Oswald. That just times, as you said, he's driving around frantically for quite a period of time. When he comes up to the Tippit, to the 10th Street intersection with Oswald, he's very calmly, very smoothly driving at a slow pace. It's timed to land right there in front of those houses. That's where you planted witnesses. There's no good in pulling him up at the corner of Denver. Planted witnesses are back over here. So the whole thing had eyes on Oswald the whole way. They weren't going to let him out of their sight. If you got a patsy, you can't let him just suddenly disappear. Get cold feet. You have to control the event. So they've controlled the event right to that point. they would have had eyes behind him all the way. And I have done some work already on T.F. Bowley, who we talked about earlier, who just happens to be following up, coming in the same direction as Benavides was supposedly coming in his truck, coming from the 10th and Marsalis area and driving in a westerly direction. Would be, in theory, following where Oswald had walked. Now, if we're looking at who's coordinating the witnesses on the ground, they can't just say to Scoggins on Thursday night, here's what we want you to do, be there tomorrow at 1 o'clock. They have to have people on the ground to make sure all of these players are in place and that the go is a go, because you have to change things tactically on the ground if things need to be changed. There would have been other people there. I think it's highly suspect that a Bowley just happens to appear there. So we've got another well-connected Ruby. So we've got everybody there as Ruby. I think Benavides has got a little bit of Ruby connection, but the stronger ones are Scoggins, Markham, and then you've got T.F. Bowley. So Bowley, I think, probably had a wider role that time. I would not be surprised if he's just driving around the suburbs and giving the all clear that things are in place. I think Tippit would have had possibly someone, and it may have even been Max Long down the other end at the destination, down near the Abundant Church. It's able to signal Tippit to start moving slowly. Because someone has to get Tippit right there at that point to intercept the man, which I believe is Oswald.
There's an important person we haven't mentioned, Harry Olson, who was a dirty cop who was nearby. He often, well, he was quoted as saying he was guarding an estate nearby. And that kind of fooled people because it was kind of a rundown neighborhood. But he was just in a house, a couple blocks away. And some people think he was kind of the coordinator of some of these activities. And the place where he was had a vantage point. You could see all the different streets and you could see people coming and going. And he was a very peculiar character, and he was dating a Ruby stripper. And the night, I forget if it was the Friday night or the Saturday. I guess it was the Friday. Harry Olson and his girlfriend sat in a car with Jack Ruby downtown for quite a long time, and they were egging Jack Ruby on to kill Oswald. So, Ruby needed convincing, and Harry Olson was involved. And it's interesting that Chief Curry fired Harry Olson. He was the only policeman fired after this whole corrupt incident. That Dallas police had a horrible reputation after this. And he left town with his girlfriend and moved to California. One thing we should also say, another possible purpose of killing Tippit, but it's certainly a result of it, is suddenly hordes of policemen swarmed into Oak Cliff from downtown, and drained the downtown area where they should have been investigating the murder of the president. And something like 30 police cars showed up at the theater. And if Oswald was supposed to be killed by Tippit and Menzel, he didn't get killed, and then he got to the theater, and I think he was probably supposed to be killed in the theater. And but he had the foresight to shout, "I am not resisting arrest. I'm not resisting arrest." And there were about something like 20 civilians in the theater, and mostly young people, and oddly including a pregnant woman. What was she doing there watching a war movie on a Friday afternoon? But there were witnesses, and so Oswald escaped. Dwight MacDonald, the famous critic of Esquire, said that Oswald had a miraculous survival for 48 hours in the custody of the Dallas police. But so he got hauled off in a police car and survived. And then they had the problem, how do you get rid of this guy? And they had to bring in Jack Ruby to shoot him on Sunday morning on television. But, part of the reason to kill the cop, when, as Lavelle confirmed to me, and I know this from covering the police as a reporter, that if a policeman is killed, that takes precedence over everything, even the murder of the president. Policemen get very, very upset, even if they don't like the cop. And Tippit was not particularly well liked, but it just strikes them at their heart, and so they all swarm over the scene. And so it's one way to try to eliminate the patsy is to get a cop killed and then use that as an excuse.
Yeah, look, I've heard that one, and I get it. Um, I look at it again through my law enforcement background and go, well, where have they staged the scene for the interception? And it's right here with key players, staged events, planted witnesses, and we've covered some of that information already. When you look at the theatre, you've got a different controlled space. You don't, as far as I can tell, there's no planted witnesses in there. You've now got a situation that's less controlled than what you had before. You had limited police involvement. Some people, Tippit obviously one, mental in the background. You mentioned Harry Olsen. Where exactly was he? That's a controlled environment to take care of the patsy, to kill the patsy. Once you've got this moving feast, you've now mixed up some bad cops with some good cops who are just responding to someone shot a cop. You then have the theatre situation where if Oswald's just sitting there on his own and that Nick McDonald is just walking up the aisleway that tells him to get to his feet and all those sort of stories that we're told happen, that's not really a plan for take out the patsy. The plan, if you're going to do that, relies on two things happening. One is Jim Mars has talked about this, saying that it was expected Oswald would get up and do a run and they'd shoot him. Now, that's not a plan when you're not controlling the event. You're hoping the person will do what you think they'll do, and then you'll do something. That's not a plan. That's winging it. So if there was a plan to take care of him at the theatre, they had ample opportunity. Two policemen could have very simply walked straight up that aisle, and all that's got to happen before he ever yells out, "I'm resisting," or "not resisting arrest," all that's got to happen is he's got a gun. Bang. It's over in a flash, and that the Oswald exhibit gun is then thrown into evidence on the floor right next to him. So, it doesn't sell, as far as I'm concerned, that was a plan to kill Oswald. And that's where I come back right from the get-go. If the plan is the Dallas police are the only one that can take some justice action here on a murder or on a killing, I believe Oswald's actually defending himself, and he knew what was going to go down.
Why wouldn't they kill him, though, when they had the chance?
Yeah, I've mentioned this to you already, Gavin, in our episode, but Nick McDonald was not supposed to be at that theater at all. He was told not to go, and he disobeyed a direct order because of the fact he was upset that a cop got killed. He was riding around with a trainee at the time. Apparently, they had people ride with them for a couple of weeks before they start going out onto their own. But Nick McDonald originally went to a library where there was a teenager that he pulled a gun out on, and then he got the call about an officer being killed, and that's when he said, "I'm not going to sit around and wait," and that's when he converged on the theater. But he was...
I think McDonald was also calling him over to the church at one stage. Well, I think what that indicates is that they didn't have a plan to kill him at the theatre. And Nick McDonald, I don't think, was involved in any plan to kill him. I think McDonald's got involved in the hunt.
Nick McDonald was an honest cop, not involved in the conspiracy. And I put more weight in the fact that the Warren Commission, and he really wasn't focused on in any other interviews. He's gave newspaper interviews, but he's been largely forgotten by history as he's the arresting officer of Lee Harvey Oswald. And he got into a fight and a tussle with him. But besides maybe a YouTube interview you can watch where he explained what happened, the fight and everything like that. But I've seen many people talk about either Nick McDonald was punched in the face so hard that he fell to the ground or his hat fell off or something like that. And then he talked about not being punched at all, and then not even punching Oswald. But if you look at the photos, he's got a black eye.
Well, so, he was kind of a glory-seeking fellow, though. He actually...
He sells a photo of himself on eBay holding the gun and everything, yeah.
He also wrote a little piece. I mean, obviously just gave an interview to the local paper, and they put his byline by Nick McDonald, "How I Arrested Lee Harvey Oswald." And he got some fame and notoriety for a brief time out of that. He was the arresting officer. But there actually was a swarm of officers converged on Oswald, but McDonald was the guy who, I guess, he had a cut on his face, and Oswald had a cut on his face too. And
I just look at it, if the whole 10th Street setup that we've just discussed with hunting Oswald and planted witnesses and all of that going on, connections to Ruby, etc. If the plan was then he's actually going to be killed in the theatre, well, the plan failed. It didn't
Well,
work.
there were a couple of staged people there. There was Johnny Brewer, the shoe salesman, who allegedly tipped off the police that a guy had walked into the theater without paying, but there was a fellow with him named Tommy Rowe, who is another Ruby connection. And there were two IBM employees, is the way Brewer identified them. And these guys were the ones who fingered Oswald and were responsible for all these police cars converging on the theater and pointing out Brewer gets the credit or whatever for pointing out Oswald to the cops, but apparently Tommy Rowe was the guy who actually did it. So those guys were somehow planted on the scene to some extent. And there was this mysterious arrest in the balcony too, that they hauled somebody out and they let him go. And there was a man named Bernard Hare who owned a store nearby, and he witnessed the what he thought was the arrest of Oswald back in the alley, and there were policemen with rifles, and the guy who was arrested was let go and either put in a car or a truck and driven off. And
Well, one of the officers' testimonies that I feel like we have to put some weight into is Bob K. Carroll, who was one of the guys who was carrying or arresting Lee Harvey Oswald and walking him out the front door. You can see a lot of the interviews, he's usually standing behind Oswald, but he talks about in his testimony that, what was going on with Oswald was what was he saying? And he was like, he was screaming like, all I had was a gun on me. Like that he's just saying simple things like that. And he's also screaming police brutality. So it's like, if he didn't do that, would he have been shot? He was protesting as soon as he stood up. Apparently
but the gun was probably planted on him because, there is no evidence that he owned a gun. And it's what they call what is it called? The throwdown gun that they plant on people sometimes. And but Oswald, there was a mob outside the theater, is like a lynch mob was going to
they said kill that SOB.
Yeah, they were going to get him. And there's also a strange fellow named Stuart Reed who took photographs of the arrest outside the theater, and he had been downtown shortly after the assassination. He took pictures of the bus that Oswald was riding in. And he also took a picture of the school book depository. Oswald got on a bus, and the bus got stuck in traffic, so he left and took a cab. And why was this guy Stuart Reed taking color photographs of the bus and then the arrest? How did he know to go to Oak Cliff? And one theory is that there were two police officers who got on the bus right after Oswald had left, and they might have the plan might have been to kill Oswald on the bus. And Stuart Reed was an employee of the U.S. government, and he was working in Panama, and he was in Dallas for reasons unknown. And he left his film at a local store to be developed, and he left instructions for the film to be sent to the FBI. So what's that all about? So apparently the government had this fellow following Oswald, taking photographs too. So if Oswald
I think that comes back to, Joe, you're spot on, that they've not taken eyes off Oswald no matter what's going on. There's other people that have been watching that event and would have actually watched Tippit get shot. Now, their role at that point is not to go in and offer assistance or chase or whatever. Their mission is to keep their eyes on Oswald and find out where he's gone. So it may well be that they've got hold of Brewer at a later point and said, we've got a job for you to do this. I don't know. But I certainly believe that if the plan was to take out Oswald in the theatre, that three officers walking very quickly up, one comes from behind, two from the side, and one just yells out, he's got a gun, bang. Because
probably, as you suggest, the fact that there are a lot of civilians in the theater and it was not planned necessarily, that would explain why he didn't get killed in the theater. But
the plan failed if it was a plan.
Yeah, and we could It's interesting to try to reverse engineer the
If you didn't
plot.
get shot at the Tippit scene and the plan fails, then you're expecting a bunch of Dallas police officers to make a move in the quick time to say, okay, we'll just have them and shoot him at the theater. I mean, I don't know a whole bunch of people. If the plan fails, I feel like they would wait for an order if it was going to be something like that.
I think the plan failed at the Tippit scene because they made one big mistake. They should have had a second officer with Tippit. Now, that wouldn't have probably been the norm for people patrolling, etc. I think they made a mistake. If you had two officers there, Oswald might have shot Tippit, but I don't think Oswald would have survived. But
Well, I guess Menzel would have been the second officer, and he should have been right behind him in his car, probably. Huh?
yeah, look, or it's Menzel in that alleyway, in the driveway, in the alleyway there behind it. We don't know. It's quite possible it is him. I think that why I'm alluding to those calls being that, I'm going to intercept them to pull over an officer with a person, that suspect walking in the westerly direction from the 10th and Marsalis incident. That's what that second police car is going to be. It's going to be on the scene in a flash. He would reverse out that driveway, straight around the alley, and he pulls up behind Tippit. So you've got three or whatever cops, several cops there at the scene straight away, controlling the scene, throw down gun, throw down wallet. You've got no pedestrians out there at this point in time, or very few. And as we're now seeing, pedestrians that were around there are planted witnesses. But if I could just touch on, there's a couple of things you've touched on there, which I think are very good. I've done a bit of work on the Burnout Hare and Butch Burroughs information. And I think Jim Mars has done some very good work in bringing that all up, but I think he's got the times wrong. And I don't know, are you able to do a share screen? I can quickly just put this up on the screen, Robbie. Am I
Yeah,
able to
we're
do
gonna
a
have
share
to find a wrapping point here. We're going on 2 hours.
Okay, I'll just put this up. Is that showing?
No, now you have the ability to share.
Oh, yeah, you could share it now.
Yeah, what did I do with it?
Don't forget, I gotta edit this. So.
Oh, you got it.
You guys talk. I'll try and. Well, actually, no. I'll dig it up, Robbie, and you can attach it to the.
Well, I'll mention one thing about Tippit that I think is worth my mentioning when you ask why I got interested in Tippit. One of the David Bellin, who is one of the most strident Warren Commission counsel, called the Tippit murder the Rosetta Stone of the case, and by that he meant basically if Oswald shot Tippit, he therefore shot Kennedy, which is not logical because you could have shot a policeman without shooting the president, But I took it as a kind of an interesting way of looking at the Tippit case. It's the Rosetta Stone of the case for other reasons. It opens up all these avenues that, as Gavin said, we wouldn't have known about a lot of these people if this incident hadn't happened. And Penn Jones, who was a great researcher, who was a small town newspaper editor publisher outside Dallas in Waxahachie, Texas, told me, and he told other people this all the time. He said, take one aspect of the case, one that hasn't been studied enough, and research the hell out of it. So I took that as my motto and tried to research the hell out of Tippit. And so then you got Gavin, you got John Armstrong, you got Greg Lowry and other people. And it's like a relay race, in my view. And preceding us was Larry Ray Harris and Gary Muir and other people, So
I can't pull that thing up. Sorry about that. I'll try and get it to you. But I think, Joe, you've probably seen it, that the screen that shows the theatre plan for that day has the doors opening at 12:45, ticket sales. We have 1 o'clock. There's a 20-minute session that is a colour cartoon. It's the news item, and it's advertisements, and it's on the schedule. And that's the schedule that that fella Atchison, who worked as a junior 17-year-old in the Texas Theatre, souvenired years ago. He donated it to the Sixth Floor Museum. That's where I got it. I saw it. So it's showing that at 1:20 is when the movie feature starts, and we've got Audie Murphy for several minutes doing an introduction about war heroes, et cetera, et cetera. So the movie's not underway until probably 1:25 proper. And then we've got several minutes after that when we've got the Jack Davis interaction with Oswald, bumping him in the seat, getting him to get up while he gets in and moves next to him, then next to him. then goes around to the other guy up in the opposite aisle from Jack Davis. But it's interesting with Butch Burroughs because his original information that Mars put out there was that it was around about 5 minutes past 1 that Oswald, he didn't see him, but suggested snuck into the theatre. But Burroughs is adamant too, several times he says it, the feature movie had already commenced. The patrons were sitting down watching it. Well, it doesn't start till 1:20, 1:25. And so I think the timings are out right from the get-go. The popcorn at 1:15 is more than likely it's 20 minutes after that. We're talking 1:35.
Or
Because-
he's just meaning when it said it started was when the lights went down and the advertisements or whatever starts playing, because that's
Yeah,
when I consider
trailers
a movie
and all
starts.
that.
Yeah,
I
that's
mean,
when I
maybe
consider
that's-
a movie starts.
Yeah.
No, I don't think he is. He said it several times that he talks about the feature film had already started. The patrons are sitting down watching it. And Jack Davis pretty well says the same thing, because around about 1:30 is when Jack Davis starts to talk about this interaction that occurs with Oswald. He said, the man that I saw pulled out in front of me at the lobby is the same guy who was trying to get into my aisle. I had to get out of my seat, let him in. He immediately sat next to me, then just propped himself up and moved another seat down. He then waited a little while, got out, did exactly the same thing with the guy in the aisle opposite Jack. Jack Davis then says that he lost sight of him. He never saw him go into the lobby. He lost sight of Oswald.
Wait, so this guy's complaining that he had to get up and because Oswald had to get through?
Well, he thought it was strange that Oswald would sit next to him, I think, because Jack Davis was a teenager, I think, at the
Hang
time.
on though, but if he's complaining about getting up because this guy has to get through, do you complain when the movie's not rolling, or do you complain when the movie is starting?
Well, Jack Davis is adamant the movie's playing. He's been watching it for a while. But he's explaining this scenario, and it's occurring at 1:30, 1:35, somewhere around there. And he says that this interaction occurred. He lost sight of Oswald. He didn't see him go into the theatre. Now, Jim Mars's book, Crossfire, has Jack Davis saying that 20 minutes later, the lights came on. Jack Davis is saying, 3 to 4 minutes after this event, this seat swap changing thing going on, 3 to 4 minutes later, the lights come on. That's all he reckons it was. It wasn't 20 minutes. He's got up and straight away gone out to the lobby. And that's when he sees police coming in the door. So I've got some of this stuff which I'm trying to pull together, and we might come back on, Robbie, and run that sort of information. And
Yeah, we can discuss the Texas theater as another episode and stuff like that.
Yeah.
well, it's
Well, it
pretty
sounds
important
like-
because Mars interviewed Burroughs, and there's a tape you can see on YouTube. It's poor sound, and I've had to do a fair bit of work to really extract what they're saying. And Butch Burroughs is quite clearly talking about the feature film has already started.
Well, so the import of what you're saying is that Oswald would have had time to shoot Tippit and get to the theater in time for all this stuff to happen. Whereas in the other accounts, Butch Burroughs said that Oswald arrived at like 1:05 or something, and he wouldn't have had time. He wouldn't have had time to kill Tippit and arrive at the theater at 1:05. He went probably from his rooming house right to the theater. But then you have Greg Lowry told me, he said, the thing that drives me crazy is the two Oswalds, like he said, I can't quite wrap my head around it, but John Armstrong has done a lot of work on,
All right.
what's
You get
going
three
on.
you get 3 John Armstrong references an episode, and that's it. I can't deal with all that.
Yeah. Well, it's amazingly complicated stuff.
I'm going to ask a final question here so we can find a wrapping point, because we're going on 2 hours here. But when it comes to the overall investigative actions that came with the conclusion of the Oswald scenario and the Tippit death, whose work was responsible for that the Warren Commission used? The Warren Commission, did they investigate it at all, or did they just take the evidence that was given to them by the officers from the Dallas Police Department?
Well, there was a woman named Alfreda Scobie, who was an interesting person. She was a young lawyer from Georgia who was planted on the Warren Commission staff by Richard Russell, the elderly senator who was a member of the Warren Commission, and he was a skeptic. And she was kind of his eyes and ears, and he was kind of infirm at that point, but she would report to him. And early in my research, before the internet, you had to go to the National Archives and Xerox documents and stuff. And I found a memorandum she wrote in, I think it was March of '64, to J. Lee Rankin, the director of the Warren Commission, and she said, is anybody responsible for looking into the Tippit murder? Isn't this important? I mean, aren't we going to look into this? And I mean, they hadn't even done this before. And so Scobie asked a really good question. And so Rankin then sent a memo to the FBI, to J. Edgar Hoover, and said, please do an investigation on Tippit. So they spent about a week, and they produced a 19-page document on Tippit. That's all they did at the FBI, basically. And they had some basic facts about his life, where he was born, where he went to school, who his parents were. Edgar Lee Tippit told me the FBI came around and talked to him. And, it wasn't very informative, except it just had the basic stuff. But they didn't really investigate the murder. And I asked Jim Lavelle, I said, did you guys really do an investigation of the murder? And he said, oh, yeah, we kept, looking into it. But in reality, they dropped the ball when Oswald was shot. They just figured, okay, that's it, and that's very strange when you think about that. A police department should have investigated the murder of one of their own policemen. And pursued that case as far as they could, but they just kind of dropped it. He said once in a while a tip would come in and I'd go out and investigate it and all that, but they didn't really do much. They didn't care, which is
no. I think you're spot on there, Joe. I think the reason they haven't touched it is because it's part of the cover-up. They cannot investigate that, come up with the truth. So you've got a contaminated crime scene. You've got contaminated evidence. We know we've got this mysterious throwdown wallet that all of a sudden then disappears. You've got, I think, ballistics issues, sure. What sort of weapon was used? Was it an automatic? Did Oswald have a weapon on him when he's in the theatre? Is the one that is ordered under the name of Vidal, one that's in evidence, used at all that day, or was it planted in evidence later? And the Dallas police have set this little episode up. They can't investigate themselves to identify the crime they've just committed.
Yeah, they digging into the Tippit murder would have exposed a lot of dirt and run the risk of exposing the whole plot. And Lavelle made a comment to me. He sort of implied that they didn't really want to look into it too much because it would have embarrassed Mrs. Tippit, because Tippit was screwing around. And then he said something like, hell, if you investigated every officer in America who was screwing around, half the police departments would be in trouble, But that was another motive for not looking into Tippit very much, that he was an unsavory character. But, as Gavin says, all these facts would start to unravel if they had actually done an investigation. That's the last thing the Warren Commission wanted to do. The House Select Committee did do some investigating. They turned up Johnny Maxey Witherspoon and some other information, but they didn't really do much on it either, and so that's when I came along in the 70s, when I really started zeroing in on the case. I began my serious research in 1982, and I've been doing it ever since, actually. And I thought, this is very strange that 2 murders took place, maybe 3, because there was a report of a Secret Service agent killed that day, and that's never been really solved. I have a section on that in my book, and what's that about? But, the official story, Kennedy was shot, Tippit was shot. How come they didn't look into the Tippit murder? And I thought, well, I'll do it, and then other people, I'm glad I've sort of helped, stimulate other people to do it. And Gavin has done some great stuff.
Joe, when you look at your book, there's 675 pages there of information that you've come up with, which has really set the whole thing, as far as I'm concerned, in the right direction to unravel what really went down with the Tippit thing. And when you've got a cover up and you're trying to delve, it becomes more and more difficult. But it's just very interesting when you look at it. Families are very tight. Families are very knowing. Families are very close, and they get told things. And a lot of the information that we're able to glean when we look at it all now is coming back through the families who are being told the truth. They're being told, don't say anything, all that sort of stuff. And it's slowly coming out years and years and years and years later. But your book has certainly set the standard as far as, comparing to any other books that are written on the thing. As you said, Myers, I think, has done some good information in there, but he can't spell the word conspiracy. So it doesn't get you anywhere. There's no logical conclusions being brought out. Yours certainly does. Yeah, sure. If others, and myself included, are able to keep going and unravel a little bit more, then that's good.
Yeah, your long piece in Garrison is terrific research on the case. And, I'll just give you an example of how you say the, families are tight. Mrs. Tippit, Marie Tippit, always had policemen around her, as Greg Lowry told me. He said there was always a police car outside their house. And when in 2014, when J.D. Tippett's 90th birthday occurred, I flew to Dallas because Mrs. Tippit and her surviving children did an event at the sixth floor museum. And I had written to Mrs. Tippit when I was doing Into the Nightmare, asking for an interview, and she didn't reply. So I thought, well, I'll fly down there and maybe I could get an interview with her. So after the discussion, I went over, and she had a receiving line, and I went over and shook her hand and introduced myself and told her about the book I'd written. And I said, I'd love to interview you. I'm in town for a couple of days, and could I come and see you tomorrow? And she seemed very willing. She seemed very like a nice lady, and she said, oh, okay. And then there was a cop nearby, and Gary Mack was over and, looking at me. Gary Mack was this guy who was the head of the sixth floor museum, and he was a former conspiracy theorist who took this job. He sold out for $200,000 a year and became the arch nemesis of people who were spreading conspiracy theories on the case. And Gary Mack was gesturing madly to this cop who was Mrs. Tippit's minder. And the cop came over. I've got photographs of this. There was a friend of mine who was taking pictures. This cop comes over and says, hi, I'm in charge of Mrs. Tippit's interviews, and tell me your name. And I gave him my card, and I said, Mrs. Tippit indicated that she might be willing to see me tomorrow, and I'd love to talk to her. And I gave him the card, and he said, oh yeah, we'll check it. Of course, I never heard back from any of them. And then I was talking to Curtis Tippit, who's the youngest Tippit child, who's a very nice man. I liked him very much. We were having a nice chat, and this policeman came charging over, and he literally grabbed Curtis by the arm and yanked him away from me, and pulled, without a word to Curtis, he just pulled him out of this interview. Like, they really protected Mrs. Tippit from interviewers, and that's how Emile D'Antonio, who directed Rush to Judgment, the film, he was a radical documentarian. When they did this film in 1966, he said all the tension in Dallas was at around the Tippit murder. He said in Dealey Plaza, nobody bothered us. Everybody was relaxed. But when we started asking people about the Tippit murder and going to Oak Cliff, everybody was really tense, and the police, Domingo Benavides said he would give them an interview, and then the police told Benavides not to talk to them. And, that aspect of the case was very seriously policed.
It's the locals, it's the Dallas police, it's the people that still live there. Yeah, Dealey Plaza was probably fly-ins and gone.
Guys, I appreciate the time you guys gave me to talk on the show. I'm going to link all your guys' links. You guys kind of gave yourselves or each other shout outs about where you can find your work, but I'm going to link all the links from your previous episodes and any other links I can find in the description for people to be able to click on and follow. Hopefully we do a part 2 of this. We could talk about the movie theater a little bit more. But I appreciate the time, guys, and thank you everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for next episode.